Is that okay? I'll try and lean in a little bit. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning, even, and thank you very much for having me here today. My name is Tom Bowser, and for the next 30, 40 minutes, I'm going to tell you a little bit about red kites, beavers, and rewilding on Argaty. Now, hopefully, a lot of you have been to Argaty before, but for those of you who don't know us, we are a working sheep and beef farm located on the Braes of Doon, not too far away from here. And if you do notice, it may be because of these birds, the red kites, which first flew into our lives way back in the 1990s. For the first half of my talk, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the history of these birds and how they came to shape our future on the farm. So red kites used to be the most common bird of prey that we would find in Britain, and we would find them in rural areas, such as the one we're in here, around here, but also in our growing settlements, where they played a really important role coming down and feeding upon a lot of the refuse that we threw out in the days before sanitation and doing their bit to help keep the streets and the people there freer of disease than they would have been otherwise. If you look in the middle of this picture, you'll see perhaps the very worst picture ever drawn of a red kite perched confusingly upon somebody's head. And it gives you an idea that these birds were very, very common. And for a long time, through the medieval period, as our society was developing, I think these birds were pretty popular. In England, they were protected by royal decree. In fact, they were the first animal to be protected by the royals for their value to society. So previously, some other animals had been protected, but it was really just because the royals wanted to have more of them to hunt and they didn't want the commoners to go and kill them all. But recognizing that kites were doing their bit to keep places clean, picking up a lot of the offal and the mess, they were protected in England. In Scotland, there was no such protection, but I think there's quite a lot of evidence to suggest that these birds were popular here as well. Not least the fact that so many places in Scotland are named after the birds. So you may well know that up here we didn't call them kites, we called them gleds. And the name gled came from an Anglo-Saxon word, glida, meaning to glide. Anywhere in Scotland that has either gled or glad, another derivation in its title, probably refers to historic presence of red kites. So common examples of that would be Gladsmuir, near to Edinburgh, so literally Kitemoor, or the most famous one would be Gledstanes near Biggar, Kitestones, which is where William Gladstone's family took their name from. Now, I have a pet theory, which I can't prove, but nobody can disprove either, making it the best kind of pet theory, that if we were naming a place after an animal, it probably shows we had a favourable impression of that animal. Because with only a few exceptions, we don't generally name places after animals that we consider to be a pest species. Anyway, up until comparatively recent times, kites remained very, very common in our landscape. So if you consider the quote here, so common is the kite with us that its various modes of flight are considered an almanac for the weather. So that was taken from 1795. But compare this quote with this next one taken just over half a century later. There was shot on Saturday last by Mr. Wood, gamekeeper, one of those birds so rare with us nowadays, hawks called the kite. From so common to so rare in half a century, what happened? Well, I'm sure many of you know the answer. We had the development of the railway network, development of the breech-loaded shotgun, and these two things combined gave rise to the Victorian game shooting estates. And from that point onwards, anything that threatened game birds, or in the case of kites, which are largely scavengers, hunting really only for very small prey, anything that was deemed to threaten game birds had to go. Now, we don't know how many kites were killed year on year, estate on estate. Those gamekeeper records are frustratingly hard to find, which perhaps in itself tells a bit of a story. Perhaps this was considered such a routine part of the job that we just didn't even bother to write it down. But the records that we do have paint a pretty bleak picture. This is perhaps the most infamous of them, taken from a 3-year period between 1837 and 1840, from the Glengarry estate in Inverness. And these are all the animals that were killed in that period. So we'll see here 462 kestrels, 246 pine martens. We have 27 white-tailed sea eagles. And on the right, you will see 275 kites. Only 3 years on one estate. Closer to home here, you'll all be familiar with the wind farm on the Braes of Doon, formerly known as Calendar Hills. And in 1 year there, with a dead pony carcass laced with poison, keepers killed 105 red kites. So I think sometimes it's worth pausing to consider what these numbers mean in a modern context, because since kites have been reintroduced to this area, we think we have a thriving population of them. We have somewhere probably in the region of about 150 breeding pairs of kites, and we consider that to be a real success story. And indeed it is, considering that until 1996, when the birds were brought back to central Scotland, we didn't have any of them. To have 150 pairs is wonderful. But when you consider that in 1 year, with one pony carcass on one piece of land, gamekeepers could kill off roughly a third of the population, I think it's unimaginable to try and travel back mentally in time to a time when there was so much wildlife in Britain, when we didn't have to travel half the length of the world to see serious amounts of wildlife because we had it all here on our doorstep. These numbers just give a bit of an insight into how much we had and how much we subsequently lost. And for birds like red kites, this was the beginning of the end. When I was doing some research for a book that I wrote about them, I managed to trace the last kites in Scotland to 1917, beyond which point they vanished from all trace. Fortunately, things do take an upturn in the kite story. For all that we've treated them badly, towards the late 1800s, some people started to treat them better. So kites had disappeared from England, wiped out by persecution. They were on their way out in Scotland. And in Wales, they realised that the last pairs that they had there were getting vanishingly close to extinction too. And conservationists there then produced a miracle, and they started to bring these birds back from the brink. So they started producing instructions to gamekeepers, telling them that red kites weren't going to be a threat to their birds. They paid landowners a bounty to keep nests safe, so they stood to make more money by protecting the nests from would-be persecutors and egg collectors than by letting those people know where the nest sites were. They even got the British Army and the Gurkhas to come and patrol the nest woods to keep the bad guys away. And against all odds, the kite numbers there started to rebound. We got to our very lowest point nearly a century ago, where we only had 10 breeding pairs in Wales, all genetically traced back to one female. So a really small, really fragile population. But thanks to these protection efforts, the numbers started to grow. But kites, like all birds of prey, they have a habit of trying to return to the place that they've hatched when it's time for them to raise their own young. So all these birds were trying to go back to Wales, and the chances of them expanding back into Britain without a bit of help were very small. So come 1989, enter the man on the right here, Roy Dennis. So Roy began flying red kite chicks over by RAF jet from Sweden and started the first reintroduction projects in the Black Isle outside of Inverness and in the Chiltern Hills of England. So the birds were taken from the nest when they were about 3 or 4 weeks old, flown over, kept in release aviaries as they grew. And then when they reached about 8 to 10 weeks old, so the point when they would fly the nest where they left in the wild, the doors were opened and they were let go into their new surroundings. And this was entirely done to just break that loyalty to their home nesting sites. You know, they had to break that pattern if you wanted to get them back into the rest of the country. Now, this picture was actually taken by my mum with the final reintroduction in Scotland, which took place in the early 2000s in Aberdeenshire. She maintains that kites fly very fast when the doors finally open from their aviary. Personally, I just think it's a pretty poor picture, but it gives you an idea of how the whole process works. Anyway, so those first two projects spawned others, and little did we know that Central Scotland had been picked out as the fourth of the UK red kite reintroductions. First we knew about it was a site a bit like this. So my dad was finishing a day's work on the farm, started wandering back along the yard, and he heard this whistling call over his head. And he looked up and he thought, oh, those aren't buzzards. And so he called up the RSPB, all full of enthusiasm, and he said, guys, you're never going to believe what's flying over my farm right now. I think it's red kites, but they're extinct in this area, right? And there was a long, awkward silence. And then they let us in on the secret that they had begun this top secret reintroduction on the estate immediately next to ours, literally 5 miles away. It's roughly, for those of you that know the local area well, where the antique centre is on the far side of Doon. That was a bit of a surprise. Even more of a surprise came in 1998 when we on Argaty were home to the first Central Scotland hatched chicks that anyone knows of for over a century. With them came the RSPB's Red Kite team, wanting to monitor those birds, and when they were big enough, to get a tree climber out, take the chicks from the nest and fit them with ID, leg rings, and wing tags. And also came lots of bird watchers. So back then the internet was in its infancy, but still word got out that red kites were on Argaty, and suddenly people were wanting to come up to see them. And it gave my parents, Lynn and Neil, a bit of a quandary as to what to do to keep those birds safe. Did you try and close doors and keep people away? Well, that's particularly tricky with red kites because they know that people are messy and that we provide a lot of things that they can eat. So trying to keep people away from kites, that wasn't going to work because you would actually struggle to keep the kites away from people. So rather than closing the doors, my parents took the other route and they decided to open them and allow people to come and see these birds from a responsible distance, learn about them. We provided the kites with a small supplementary food supply, just enough to top up what they find in the wild, not so much that they would ever become tame or dependent upon it. We built a viewing hide in the hills above the farm. And from that day to this, people from all around the world have come to our farm to see these birds, to watch their spectacular flight, and to learn their history from persecution to extirpation to reintroduction and beyond. And the kite numbers have grown magnificently in that time. We do still, unfortunately, have some problems with the way that people treat them. It's a better situation than it was when kites were reintroduced in this area, perhaps due to a reduction in the amount of game shooting in this area, perhaps a reduction as well in the harsh attitudes that used to exist, a change when people are starting to realize that actually we maybe do need to try and coexist with things. But unfortunately, when you move out of this area and get into some of the grouse shooting areas, we do still have issues with people killing off red kites. But all the same, the numbers have grown spectacularly. And for us as a farm, it has given us the confidence to start looking at how we try and do a bit more for nature, how we make our home a better home for wild animals. We've been involved in red squirrel conservation and we now run viewing hides for them. We work with wildlife charities like the SSPCA to release orphaned and rehabilitated wildlife. We're looking at the farm with new eyes and saying, okay, we've got good habitat here and here, but it's disconnected. Wildlife's trapped in there. So which areas are less productive? Which could be used for something better? So we try to farm the best and do something else with the rest. We sow the unused fields with wildflowers for pollinators. We've dug out the wet corners of fields to make ponds for our growing dragonfly and damselfly populations. We've built small nest boxes for small birds and bigger nest boxes for bigger birds, not all of which are particularly pleased to see us. Ospreys are back breeding on our farm. They've been breeding with us since 2019. So another species wiped out by man in Scotland, another one back doing really well. But the fact that we're doing any of this work is all thanks to these graceful fork-tailed raptors that first flew into our lives all those years ago. Had a flap of the wings taken them in another direction, our lives would be entirely different. And before I move on to the second part of the talk, just to tell you one brief anecdote, which I think really shows the success of the reintroduction of this species. So when I was doing some research for the kite book, I spoke to the RSPB's Red Kite team. So people that I knew when I was probably about 12 years old. And apparently the office joke that they used to tell back then was, they said, guys, could you imagine if we had so many red kites in Britain that we could export them to help other countries that are struggling with their kite numbers. And this was written off as being utterly ridiculous back then because there were so few kites in Britain and so many in so many other countries. Fast forward a few years, and that's exactly what's happening. Kites from Britain are being exported to countries like Spain, which actually donated chicks to us when we first started our reintroductions. And to put an extra cherry on top of the cake, it's not just anyone that's doing it, it's the people that were working on the original red kite reintroductions, people like Duncan or Ewing, who I'm sure many of you know, are the ones that are leading this project. Our numbers are going up. Other countries' numbers are struggling, and we're able to return the favour. So from around a century ago, when we only had 10 breeding pairs of kites in all of Britain, we now have around a fifth of the whole world's red kite population. I think that's a real success story and something worth celebrating. If you're interested in knowing any more of the history of these birds in this area, I can thoroughly recommend this book. It's very, very good. On sale in the lobby bit. And I'll move on to the second half of the talk, folks, which is about these guys, the beavers. I will never forget my first visit to a beaver wetland. The air was thrumming with the sound of thousands of insects drawn in by the deadwood and the impounded water. Fish were rising again and again to feed upon them. Birdsong filled the surrounding woodland. As evening fell, the insects were being predated by bats, which was good because the insects were trying to predate upon us. All of this was thanks to the beavers who had dammed a small stream and created this massive, sprawling wetland filled with deadwood, filled with life, a birthplace of life. And that landscape in Knapdale on the west coast of Scotland, where beavers had been officially reintroduced, that place so full of life, it was really foreign to me. That place where some trees were standing in water and some lay half felled, but somehow reshooting. Really strange to me. And I remember feeling two things at the same time. The first was utterly inspired because I'd never seen so much wildlife in one place. But the other was almost angry because all of my life, I realized I had been a victim of a phenomenon known as shifting baseline syndrome, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. This idea that you accept as normal the amount of wildlife that you see around you because you've no way of traveling back to, well, say the period that I showed on a slide a few previous, when there was 275 kites to be killed off on one estate. We can't go back to those times, so we accept as normal what we see. And it was only in the presence of beavers and seeing what they'd done that I realized that this term that I had used liberally, shifting baseline syndrome, I was very much a victim of as well. So from that moment onwards, I was aware of two things. The first was that our ancestors had robbed us in Scotland of something very, very valuable when they killed the last of the beavers off around 400 years ago. The second was that given the extent of the environmental crisis, we need these animals back across Scotland as quickly as we can. And if there's one thing I would like you all to take from this second half of the talk, is that these animals matter very, very much. To give you a quick bit of history to beavers in Scotland, we know that they were widespread throughout this country. Remains of them have been found from the borders right up to the Highlands, even a midden in Edinburgh Castle, which suggests that people there must have eaten them once upon a time. We don't know exactly when they were here till. All we can do in the absence of evidence is to surmise that the reason, though, that they were killed off is the same as across their global range, which is not that they were considered a pest species, quite the opposite, that they were too valuable for their own good. So we hunted them for meat, because these animals weigh about 30 kilos when they're adults. So there's a lot of eating in a beaver, particularly back then when people were so close to starvation so much of the time. We hunted them for castoreum, a secretion that was used in perfumes and medicines. And more than anything else, of course, we hunted them for their thick, weather-resistant pelts, which were the center of the European hat trade for so long, and one of the main reasons why colonialists set sail for North America once we'd wiped out so many of our beavers here. We don't know exactly when they were here till, as I say, and even more of a mystery is quite when they came back. You'll hear, I'm sure, plenty of stories about beavers returning to Tayside before the official reintroduction began on the West Coast. You'll hear many stories about illegal releases of beavers. Nobody really knew. Until a few years ago, when a man called Derek Gow, who's been one of the main supporters of these animals, wrote his memoirs of trying to re-establish these animals in Britain. And he wrote of a wildlife park near to the River Erne, where beavers were brought and kept in a secure enclosure surrounded by an electric fence. One day, the keeper, who was going in with carrots for them, stepped over the perimeter stile, little realizing that in the night the beavers had felled a tree connecting the electric fence to the stile. The carrots went skywards. She turned off the electric fence, went home without telling anyone. When she came back a few days later to work, the carrots were still there, and the beavers most certainly were not. Derek put that date to 2001. They moved the beavers from the Erne into the River Tay, where lies some of Scotland's most valuable farmland, and the presence of a chubby semi-aquatic rodent that wants to raise water levels in places that are perfectly drained to produce a wide variety of arable crops was understandably unpopular. So in the early years, a lot of beavers were killed, and there was no protection for them. They could just be shot, and they were. But at the same time, there was a growing body of global evidence showing just how valuable these animals are for biodiversity. So in 2019, the Scottish Government granted them protected status, which meant it would be an offence to harm them or to disturb them without a licence, which would have to be sought from the nature agency Nature Scot. Conservationists rejoiced, but what looked like a red letter day was not to be, sadly. A caveat in the arrangements allowed for landowners in prime arable areas to apply for lethal control licenses when beavers were deemed to be a threat to their land. And in the first year of apparent protection, 1 in 5 of Scotland's tiny beaver population was killed under license. And the irony to all of this is that beavers back then could quite easily have been moved to less contentious areas. Nature Scot themselves, who had been issuing these cull licenses, had identified over 100,000 hectares in Scotland that were suitable for beavers to be moved to. But unfortunately, the government position was that beavers would not be allowed to be moved. It would be natural expansion of the population only. They received a lot of terrible headlines on the back of the cull stats, in particular because Scotland became the first country in history to give something protected status and then have an organised cull of it in the first year, to our eternal credit. And in a private meeting, they agreed that they might be willing to relocate beavers from conflict sites to other parts of Scotland, provided the land manager in that area that wanted to have them was within range of an existing beaver population. January 2020, my friend James Nairn, who's a trustee of the Scottish Wild Beaver Group charity, came to visit me on Argaty with a question for me. We stood on the boardwalk to the Red Kite Hyde, watching the kites gather for their winter roost, and he said, "Tom, would you be willing to try and rehome beavers that would otherwise be shot in prime arable areas?" And I thought, oh Christ, because I knew that this would be controversial. But by that point, I had been to the site of the official reintroduction, seen how much life was there, and the thought that we could do a little bit for the environment and save a few beavers to boot, get them moved from areas where they would be killed and give them a second chance at life on our farm. Well, you don't get many other chances like that. So although I knew that it would be a fight, I decided we would go for it. And pardon the pun, but we entered and took the plunge into this mad world of beavers and bureaucracy and began consulting on the idea of trying to become the first people to relocate beavers within Scotland and move them from conflict sites. And I could describe the period that followed as we started this consultation as either the best or the worst period in my life. Either would be true, because we gained so much support. We went out and started speaking to local and national stakeholders on the idea that if something was in trouble, that you move it first. You don't just reach for the gun. And so many people gave us their support. We had schools, we had community groups, universities like this one, people from all walks of life in their hundreds filled in questionnaires, wrote supporting statements saying they wanted this to happen. Set against that, we had the people that didn't want this to happen. Now, beavers, as I'm sure many of you know, are pretty widespread through this area. And by the time that we were doing this, they were about 5 miles away from Argaty. So we were consulting on the idea of moving them to somewhere they would reach anyway. So there's something a bit ridiculous about this, but I think the farming community in particular is always aware of the law of unintended consequences. So if someone wants to move them 5 miles today, someone else will want to move them 6 miles tomorrow, then it'll be a new part of Scotland entirely. And so they tried really hard to close the door on us. We had some really heated opposition. But nonetheless, we pushed through, and with the help of the wider rewilding community, we managed to get our license, and in doing so, it changed a whole government policy and began this process of relocating animals around the country. And I'll show you briefly, and hope that the sound works, a video of the first beaver release on Argaty.
Beavers are really important species and they can really manipulate landscapes. This is very important from not only a whole host of water retention benefits, but they're creating habitat for a whole series of species. In some parts of Scotland, you've got highly modified agricultural systems, but beavers, when they return to these kind of habitats, can cause impacts on farming especially. We've had opportunities to go in and trap and translocate these animals, and that's a really positive step forward. So today is a crucial step. It's a licensed condition to make sure these animals are healthy, free from disease before they're released. Up until this point, we've not been able to release beavers in Scotland. So animals that I've translocated have gone down to England. However, why this project is so exciting is this will be the first time we've released beavers again in Scotland since the Scottish Beaver Trial. So, you know, you're talking about 10, 12 years ago. But this is the first time a landowner has applied to relocate beavers onto their land. So this is a really positive step, and it's a really unique step in the beaver translocation story.
So it started with Scottish Wild Beaver Group, who approached me to ask if I knew any landowners near here who might be willing to take a beaver that would be culled otherwise and release them on ponds on their land. And I said, yeah, I might know one person who would be mad enough to do that. So I do hope that this small step will be a catalyst for getting beavers spreading across the country. We need as many beavers as we can possibly manage to have in Scotland.
What you see today, as soon as we released them, they just melted into this landscape. This really is an animal that was here, widespread. I think this is a really good news story. And to have a family group that, you know, have been trapped together, kept together, and then we can relocate them together, that in itself is special. I mean, you see 3 very healthy kits here. So, you know, this has been a really emotional day. Very happy.
We know that we need beavers, but at the moment beavers really need us as well. I think that's an important thing. You know, they're very reliant on our goodwill, and hopefully more people doing this sort of thing.
Pause a second to show you the greatest headline ever written in the history of the English language. So that was November of 2021 that we began relocating beavers, and to date we have moved 20 animals from conflict sites and released them into unfenced ponds on the farm. For the final part of the talk, I want to tell you why we did this. So now beavers are on Argaty, and their impact has been huge. Our wetlands are expanding and diversifying. Water flows in places that have stood dry for centuries. Insects feed on the sap of beaver gnawed tree stumps. Amphibians swim and breed in the canals that the beavers dig. Herons wait there for the chance of spearing food. And since moving beavers to Argaty, we have seen all sides of climate change, from the long heatwave summers to the even longer wet winters. And beavers seem to have an answer to all of these conditions. So the first full summer that we had these animals on the farm was 2022, which you may remember was one of the heatwave summers when it felt like it was never going to rain. We got really worried about one of our beaver families because the water level in their pond was going down and down all the time. And part of the reason that beavers build dams is so they can have 3 feet of water, so they can swim submerged and safe from a lot of predators like lynx and wolves and bears that aren't in our landscapes anymore, but which they've evolved to cope living alongside by being able to escape to deep water. As the water level went down in this pond, we thought they're going to leave. After all the effort of getting them here, they'll have to go down to the River Teeth, which was the only place still holding any water in the landscape. But watching the beavers at night, they had different ideas. They began doing this. So we'd come up, pushing up big armfuls of mud, and then they would do a handstand, hairy bottom shaking in the air, and come up with more mud. And we thought, what on earth are they doing? And as with most things beaver related, the truth only becomes obvious after the event. They created a landscape that was almost glacial. So they had these mountains of mud, and then they had these long, deep valleys around. Effectively, what they were doing was they dredged the floor of the pond to give themselves the depth of water that they wanted to stay safe from the wolves and everything else. Doing this entirely for their own benefit. But in that summer when water was evaporating off the landscape, where all of our other ponds were drying up to nothing, they kept water in their pond, and thousands of species flocked to it. In that harshest of summers, which just tells us how hard weather is going to be for species going forward, they were the difference between life and death for so many of them. We moved from that to the first of a series of long, wet winters when it felt like the rain would never stop. And of course, the beavers have an answer to those conditions too. Working together, the whole family created a long dam that snaked around the outflow of their pond. But the rains kept coming, and the water overtopped that dam and moved downstream. And so the beavers moved downstream too, and they built another dam. And the water hit that, and with nowhere else to go until the rain level rose up, all it could do was sink down into the ground. Eventually, because it rained so hard, it overtopped that too, and the beavers moved downstream again and again, trying to hold every drop they could prisoner in the land. This video, taken by my friend Roger, who's been doing time-lapse drone surveys, shows the changes that the beavers made in the first year of having them on the farm. So this is what it looked like when they arrived. And just keep an eye on downstream area there, which really shows the changes. So when they arrived, that's the heat wave summer, and you can see there's still water in the pond, even as the rest of the landscape's drying out. Then into a wet autumn and an even wetter winter. And you can see how much water is being held on the land there in that period. And for us as a farm, that was really significant for reasons that I'll come back to in a second. We're doing a lot of work with Stirling University, who are putting numbers on the changes that we think we're seeing happen. This picture tells 1,000 stories. So the water samples captured on the left-hand side were from above the main beaver dam. Those on the right are from below it. And you can see what the dam is doing. It's acting like a giant sieve, catching all the runoff from the land and releasing a flow of cool, clean water downstream. The Stirling University guys, they used to refer to this one particular beaver pond as the Argaty crap pond, which I was hugely offended by until the lead professor, Nigel Wilby, sent me this picture, which is what the water used to look like in that pond. And you can see it's about the color of hot chocolate. Compare that to what it looks like today. And what the beavers did when they dredged the floor of the pond, again, entirely for their own purposes, They pushed up all the leaf litter and mud that was falling down into the bottom of the pond. It came up to the surface and it oxidized. Freed from its stranglehold, the plant species that had been in the seed bank for all that time, totally choked, suddenly got a chance to breathe again. They came up and they oxygenated the water, and now we have beautiful clean water in the pond again. Again, thanks to Roger, we have this amazing time-lapse video that shows the change in aquatic plant life from start to today. What a change, eh? And for us, the biggest thrill of having the beavers on our land is this, the arrival of these guys, beaver kits. So from 2022, we have had beaver kits being born on our land every year. And as a kid, it used to seem huge that we had the first red kite chicks born in central Scotland, or hatched in central Scotland for over a century. That seemed an unimaginably vast amount of time. But consider that these are the first beaver kits to be born on that land for 4 or 5 centuries, maybe longer. So much sad history is being wiped out as these animals return to Scotland to recolonise the landscapes. They're saving us huge amounts of money too. Each winter, we used to have massive flooding issues. Thanks to the beavers and their dams, we don't have them anymore. We lost our farm track probably 5, 6 times a wet winter just to flooding issues. With dams up above our farm now, we don't have those problems. Probably saving us thousands of pounds when you consider that each time the track was wiped away, it was probably costing us about £500. So you'd replace it just for it to be put to disappear again with the next flood. But in truth, we've only had beavers on our farm a short amount of time, and our journey with them is really only just beginning. We don't really know how the journey ends. All we can do is stand back and just let nature take its course and agree that the beavers are in charge of the landscape now. And what happens next will be better than what went before. But for us as a farm and a family, it's offered us so many opportunities. Our beaver tours that we run from spring through to the end of summer sell out within seconds. It's the first time, I think, in wildlife tourism since the arrival of the kites that we've had something that has been so popular and such a clamour to see an animal. We filmed with Gordon Buchanan, and then last summer, Springwatch came and filmed live with us, where presenter Megan McCubbin described beavers as having the finest backside in the animal kingdom, which I thought was quite a line. But what matters more than us is what's happened for beavers in Scotland since we began relocating them. So our hope was that although we were only moving these animals a few miles from where they were already, that it would be a catalyst, that others would follow suit and we would start to see them restored across the country. And of course, that's exactly what's happened. We have had the RSPB, Forestry and Land Scotland, and others doing within range translocations, moving beavers to sites close to where they'd expanded to naturally. But the biggest one came in 2023 when the Cairngorms National Park began relocating animals to a place they couldn't have got to otherwise due to steepness of terrain, hydro dams, etc. It was the first time since the original reintroduction in Knapdale that there'd been an authorised release to an entirely new part of Scotland. And when you think that just a few years prior to that, you could move them 5 meters when they came into conflict with people, it feels like a good change. Again, if you're interested in any more of this history, folks, this is my favourite book on beavers. But I'd like to end with a couple of hopes. You remember that phrase I talked about earlier, shifting baseline syndrome? Only ever used in a negative sense. My hope, though, is that we start to use this term in a more positive one going forward, that maybe with beavers back in our landscape, that we start talking about having more wildlife than our parents did, than our grandparents did, this animal that's scientifically shown to increase biodiversity. I hope they make the change and that our kids know more than we did. This is the wall of the older daughter's primary school in Doon. Many of you will be familiar with. And you'll see on the right hand of these posters a picture of a red kite flying over Doon Castle. It would be better if there was a beaver swimming in the River Teith as well, but you know, we can't blame kids for trying. Kids walk past that every day. They don't even look twice at that picture. It's normal to them. They don't even look twice at the red kite that flies over their school every day. It's normal. And my other hope is that as these animals that we wiped out and that we've brought back return to our landscapes, that it just becomes a normal thing, that our kids don't even realize there was a time when these animals weren't here. Then I think we'll know that we've done our job. Folks, thank you very much. Cheers.